When I was younger, I definitely at some point heard the story of the Elves and the Shoemaker, and I don't remember exactly who told me it. I don't have memories of my parents telling me it while I was sitting on their lap or anything like that, but I've definitely vaguely known it for as long as I can remember, more or less. The story was originally written down by the brothers Grimm, who were German, and it was originally written in German in 1812, although it seems to have come from an older story, and even disregarding the specifics of the story, I think it must have come from an older tradition, which I'll explain the reasons for later in the video. The story is that there was a shoemaker who'd become very poor, and he only had enough leather to make one more pair of shoes. So he cut the templates for the shoes one evening and then went to bed without finishing them, and when he woke up he found that they were finished to an extremely high standard. They were really well made, and because they were so well made he sold them for more than he expected to. So using that money he bought the leather for 2 pairs of shoes, cut the templates and went to bed, and the next morning they were both done again, and he sold them both, and this pattern went up sort of exponentially, and very quickly he had quite a lot of money and he didn't need to worry about money anymore. So one evening him and his wife decided to stay up to see how the shoes were getting made, and they hid in a corner behind some clothes and watched the workbench, and eventually 2 little naked men walked into the room, made the shoes very quickly, and then left. And the shoemaker's wife was obviously grateful that these 2 little men had basically made them rich, so she made some little clothes to keep them warm, and told the shoemaker that he should make them some little shoes. And they put the clothes and the shoes on the workbench and stayed up to see what would happen. And when the men came in, they saw the clothes, they put them on happily, and they sung, "Sind wir nicht Knaben glatt und fein, was sollen wir länger Schuster sein?" And they ran away and never came back, although the shoemaker and his wife carried on doing well for themselves. The reason I find this story so interesting is because it's clearly related to stories from other parts of Europe. It reminds me of stories from northern England and southern Scotland about a small creature that lives in people's houses and does various things, from helping with household tasks to sort of irritating things like, I don't know, killing livestock or making livestock run away. And a recurring theme is that if you give them clothes, they'll sing a rhyme and then disappear forever. And the wording of the rhyme doesn't show a lot of consistency from place to place, so sometimes it's implied that the creature leaves because it's offended that you've given it clothes. Sometimes it's implied that these creatures for some reason aren't supposed to wear human clothes and that's why they disappear. And of course, like in the German story, it seems like they're leaving because they think they're now too good to work for people, now that they've got nice clothes. And many people watching will know that these stories of little people living around the farmstead exist in Scandinavia as well, although all the depictions I've seen of those people have been wearing clothes. I think at least in modern depictions, they're often wearing pointy hats as well, and they're more consistently people but scaled down, whereas depictions of the Scottish and Northern English equivalents are sometimes hairier or less human-shaped. So far I've mentioned folklore from areas that speak Germanic languages, so my temptation as a historical linguistics person is to try to reconstruct a Proto-Germanic word for whatever this thing is, and to push the story back to the Germanic Iron Age and claim it must have existed in Old English and Old Norse and Old High German. But this is a sort of cautionary, well, not a cautionary tale, but it's sort of, I suppose this is me advising you about doing that kind of thing, and perhaps advising you not to do that kind of thing. So for one thing, we can't reconstruct a Proto-Germanic or even an Old English word for this elf thing, because every tradition with it in uses a different root. In Scandinavia you find, and sorry if I pronounce these wrong, Nisse and Tomte. In Scotland and Northern England you find Brony, Hob and Dobby. In Germany you find Wichtelmann. In the Netherlands you find the similar Gabauter. None of these words is related to any of the others, and in fact a lot of them are quite hard to even work out an etymology for, full stop. A couple of them might be shortened versions of common names, and the Wicht in Wichtel comes from a common Germanic root meaning a living thing or a creature. So why does this one thing have several names? One possibility is that these are genuinely a load of completely separate folk traditions that popped up independently of each other. It's also possible that the traditions popped up separately and then influenced each other and developed those similarities later on as a result of that influence. Yet another possibility is that they're related, but that there's some cultural reason that the name for this thing is historically unstable and prone to being replaced over time. So for example, in an older version of the story, there might have been a superstition that saying these people's name would draw their attention and make them appear, or make them angry. And so people came up with nicknames for them and avoided using the actual word so much that it disappeared in all of the branches. But because most of the stories were only written down 200 or so years ago, there's no way of knowing if this is true, if these stories came from a common tradition. One thing that interests me about these stories is the feelings that they create in me. The idea of a family sitting in one firelit room and of some little creature pottering around in another room just makes the world feel a bit more alive and mysterious. And it's hard to put into words other than by giving examples of the feeling. So sometimes when I'm in Cumbria, I walk down a road that goes past a lot of fields that sometimes flood in winter. And there are trees between the road and the fields, but at dusk you can look through the trees and imagine there are the silhouettes of a few little men working in the fields completely silently, and you wouldn't notice them unless you looked hard. This is the kind of feeling I get. This is not an actual description, I don't actually see little men in the fields. But our feelings about these things are deeply personal, and they're fairly unlikely to be the same from one person to the next. So for me in everyday life, I'm almost sort of pathologically extroverted, and I'm always more comfortable if I have people around me. So the idea that there are always these people pottering around the world getting on with their own business makes me feel like I have company even when I'm actually on my own. It also makes me feel connected to something older. The idea of stone houses with wood-panelled walls, and a sort of time when everybody was involved in agriculture. But if you were somebody living back then, at a time when everybody was involved in agriculture, maybe these stories would just seem current and normal to you, and maybe they wouldn't evoke the same sense of cultural history. There's an entire subfield of anthropology that looks at stories like this and tries to work out if you can triangulate them back through history. And this reminds me of the idea of hierarchical clustering in statistical analysis. You take two data points that are most similar to each other, put them together in a little group, and then you take the groups that are most similar to each other and put them together into bigger groups until you have a big tree showing how the points are related. You can apply this in biology to work out how different species are related to each other. And applying it to stories is obviously a bit harder. In the case of the Elves and the Shoemaker, you might be able to draw out vague, tantalising patterns of similarity and difference. So, in older depictions of household elves, the idea of them wearing red hats appears a lot in Scandinavia, a little bit in northern England and Scotland. The idea of them running away when they're given clothes and singing a little rhyme looks like it appears more where people speak West Germanic languages, like in German in England. But this is just going off the limited data that's available online, and even so, it doesn't come out with any neat clades. It would be nice if the Scandinavian stories had a load of features in common, and the German stories had a load of features in common, and the Scottish stories had a load of features in common, but there just isn't enough data to claim something like that. I'd lump these things together as obviously related folkloric traditions that have probably influenced each other too much to even try to reconstruct any kind of ancestral proto-story. But I think that's okay. These stories exist in their own right as modern or slightly pre-modern traditions. Somebody from Penrith will view these stories slightly differently to somebody from Dumfries, and they'll both view them very differently to somebody from Ireland. The feelings these stories evoke are actually probably very modern, as I've said. They're probably influenced by the literature we've read or the films we've watched, and it's important to remember that people from the mid-1800s probably had a very different set of feelings about these stories, which were influenced by the media they'd consumed in their own lives. To some extent that might be because, as modern people, and I'm counting people from the 1800s as modern to all intents and purposes, each one of us is raised through very different social institutions, and this is something my friend Hannah talked to me about a while ago. We all learn to do slightly different things when we're younger, we all read slightly different books as we grow up, we're all friends with different groups of people at school, and this is compounded by the fact that all the people we interact with have also been raised through a load of different social institutions, which we're exposed to through them. We all watch different TV programmes and read different books and go to different schools, we're exposed to different religions a lot, and we've all travelled to different places to a greater or lesser extent over the course of our lives. People in the late medieval period, for example, did get filtered through different social institutions, but possibly to a lesser extent. So people born in the same village would know all the same people growing up, they probably all had very similar religious backgrounds and went to the same church, consumed the same stories as each other, listened to the same music as each other, whatever secular music was around the village at the time, and all had very similar physical experiences in terms of what the weather was like and what the landscape looked like at different times of year. So I suppose there's a better chance that people raised in that environment might all have had similar emotional responses to the idea of elves living around the house, if that folkloric tradition existed for them. The idea of these creatures living around the house is appealing for various reasons, and I think if there's any lesson at the end of this ramble, it's that regardless of how far back in time the modern traditions extend, they are modern traditions. These stories still exist and they still evoke particular feelings in us. And if we can't access the feelings somebody from 1800 or 1600 might have had about these stories, maybe we should record how we feel about them and what they make us imagine and what they remind us of. Because that way, somebody in the future who discovers this tradition in a book will at least have some kind of data point from outside their own time. Here's my own contribution to the tradition, which I've written up in 19th century Cumbrian, because I've got some nice footage from Cumbria and nothing topical to put over it. Tobbs and Shoemaker. An odd Shoemaker Jans lived with his wife i Sebrum. They were our pair, and nobody had ja mer bit a ledder at Mac Shoon wid. Shoemaker cut out a pair of shoon and went to bed. Jansi got up, he went back and carry on with shoon, and found them mad. He sold them and got a knife at get ledder at Mac 2 pair of shoon. It happened again, and he had ledder at Mac 3 pair of shoon. Soon, him and his wife was rich. His wife proposed that they check why was making shoon and making him rich. Ja night they hid in some clothes and waited. After not so long, 2 men come out with 9 clothes of them and set to work making shoon. Shoon was mad, and the men went away. Twice settled Shoemaker, she said, we mun give him somewhat for this day and all makes the things for us. Shoemaker said to her, he said, aye, we mun. So the mad clothes that give little all men, and they left them and waited till the men came. Jans they came, the men looked at clothes and sang this. Gi brownie a quart, gi brownie a sark, yous get nae mair a brownie's work. And they ran away and was never seen again.